So here we are in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, and we here see something that we are familiar with, something that we might see written on many a church wall, the 10 Commandments. And as we look at verses 1 to 21, we'll split this chapter roughly into two halves. And as we look at the first half, verses 1 to 21, the danger that we can often find is that familiarity can breed blindness. So familiar with these words, or so we think, we can fail to see or understand what they say. Not only what they said then, but how we should understand them today. What do they say today? And one of the first things that I want to draw out in this sort of first half, and we see it tucked away there in verse 3. It was not with our fathers, but with us. And it reminds us that God's word, although spoken in the past, is both current and relevant to the present. God has spoken, and he continues to speak, and he speaks into the present context, our present context. And we see echoes of this in what we call the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5 to chapter 7. And we see Jesus repeatedly say, "You heard it was said, but now I say to you." And we'll come back to that in a moment. That sort of, this is the baseline of the law that was given, and how do we reinterpret it for today? And so we see, the first thing we see is God's word, living and active, speaking into the present. It should never be simply some tome that sits on a shelf and gathers dust. The second thing we see is that they were given both for the first time and for this second time. These 10 commandments were given as a whole. They were not and are not intended to be seen selectively. I like this one, but not that one. And again, we see Paul when he writes, if you stumble at one point in the law, it's as if you've broken the whole law. These were given as a whole, as a block. There was no optional sort of choice in here. They were there as a whole, and it's the same today. We can't say, I'll love this neighbor, but not that one. Or we can't say, well, I'm home alone tonight, so I'll do this or that. No one will know. And the third thing we notice is their structure. Love God, love neighbor. As we notice how the first 4 of the commandments focus upon our relationship with God, and the remaining 6 focus upon our relationship with our neighbor. I'll put neighbor in inverted commas, but focus upon our relationship with others. And again, we see that we can't split or separate these two out. And we see something of that when Jesus encounters the rich young man. And Jesus lays out to him the second 6 commandments. And the young man says, I've done all of these. And Jesus says, but what about the first 4? And so today the same, our fulfilling the latter 6 of these commandments, being a good person, doesn't make us a Christian, doesn't make us right with God. That's why they're in the order they are. Being right with God should make us right with our neighbor. And then we'll see as we go through Deuteronomy how all of the other laws that Moses sort of expounds, that Moses gives, we'll see how they are simply an extension and an outworking of these. And then as we come to verses 22 to 33, the second half of this chapter, what we start to see here is the distinction between these two, the 10 commandments and then the rest of the laws that Moses is going to give, this sort of outworking and opening out of these laws. We see the fundamental laws or principles given by God, these 10 commandments. They are spoken by him to the people. They were written in stone by him for the people. These laws are the permanent foundation, if you like, for the people of God. And we see echoed here and already. Don't add to them or detract from them. Which is why, when asked, Jesus says, and we echo it regularly in our services, the greatest commandment is this: love God, love your neighbor. And what we see opening out in this second half of chapter 5, and we'll see it as we go through Deuteronomy, is that the rest of the laws that Moses gives are then specific to a particular time. So these sort of the outworking of these 10 commandments, that the laws and rules and regulations that Moses sort of develops, they were given to the Israelites for their life in the promised land. They were not given for their life in the wilderness, nor were they given for their life in exile. They were given for the promised land. And so we see, and today need to learn again, the absolute and fixed foundation for the people of God is to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. But how we do that and how we express that today is something we're called to constantly reflect upon and to seek God's guidance upon. Which, as we think about this, might just challenge us. What we see as important church meetings and activities, and what we see as a structure for our worship today, is it something that was for the past? A real challenge. How do we understand and interpret those fundamental, timeless laws that God has given us? Love God, love our neighbor. How do we outwork those today in our present? Now that's